Ladies and gentlemen, we, people of color, daughters and sons of immigrants, we belong to Europe. I am, we are the story of Europe.
Hello everybody, welcome to our podcast We Belong. We Belong is a bold statement for young women of color living in Europe. I'm Yasmina Wiran and I'm an expert on peace and security at the AU-EU Youth Cooperation Hub, and I'm an advocate for social inclusion and gender equality. We Belong goes beyond the simple fact of existing. It's a claim for space, a need for acknowledgement, a quest for representation, power, and inclusion. It's the stories of women that work day by day to break stereotypes, to change norms, to shape new narratives surrounding immigrant descents living in Europe. We will travel across European countries and hear their stories of activism, entrepreneurship, leadership, or simply struggle for recognition and respect. For this first episode, we are in France, Paris, the city of love. I arrived yesterday in France, and my first guest is Inès Seddiki. Inès is the founder of Get Up. Get Up is an association, an NGO, and Inès, she's a French-Moroccan young activist and a corporate social responsibility consultant. In the 80s, her parents immigrated to France to pursue the ideals of liberty and equality. And from a very young age, Inés was exposed to injustice and the urge to take action. So Inés is here with me today, and I'm happy to welcome her. So welcome, Inés.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to introduce our format. For every woman that we will interview, we will hear one word, one story, and one key. So today we want to hear your word. What is your word?
So my word is in French, but I will translate it. In French, it's pouvoir, which translates into power or ability, which is, we'll talk about it later, but for me, a key to be able to have power, you need to have tools, you need to have knowledge, and that's how you gain power. So in French, the word pouvoir recovers both the meanings, and I find it very, very interesting.
Thank you. Power. What a beautiful word that you choose. And I'm sure that your story will resonate with this notion of power. So, as I said, Inés, you were born in Paris, in a Parisian banlieue, and you work both for social justice and youth empowerment. And you are a French and Moroccan activist. In the 80s, your parents immigrated to France to pursue the ideas of liberty and equality, and from a very young age, you were exposed to injustice. And this is why you started to engage in the community and to address the need for young girls to exist in the public space. So please tell us more about your youth in French banlieues and your story.
Sure, thank you very much, Yasmin. So yes, I grew up in the Parisian suburbs, which are actually the underprivileged areas in Paris, because the suburbs are usually in the English-speaking countries, it's more the center of wealth, and in France, it's more the outskirts and where all the poverty and the social exclusion exists. So I grew up in the north of Paris, in a city full of immigrants and children of immigrants. And I had to, yes, as you said, face a lot of inequalities very early in my childhood. I saw economic inequalities. A lot of my friends' parents were unemployed and they lived in very complicated situations. And the violence that exists in the families, amongst the youth, but also the violence that society puts on us as people from lower social background and all. And so I grew up with that, with the fact that there are 2 different fronts, at least, if not 3 or 4. And it was something really hard for my parents as well when they arrived, because, as you said, they came to France because they were activists in Morocco, and they faced some problems there. So they came to France, and they were like really excited about the liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And but when they arrived in the suburbs, they discovered a whole different story in a different reality. And so very early when they arrived, they were not French yet, and they created an organization, a grassroots organization in the suburbs to help migrants and people who just arrived from foreign countries, who were refugees, for example, to work on their administrative tasks. They help them have access to lawyers. They really use their ability to speak and write French to help the others. And everyone would come home to where we live, and I would take phone calls and answer the buzzer, and tell my parents that this person's here. And so our house was basically like a social center. So I grew up like that, with going to protests. So it was really in my DNA. And growing up, I really tried to also find my way to contribute to a more inclusive society and tackle injustice. And it has always been something really important to me. So even when I decided, it's also another story, but when I went to business school, because I didn't really know all the options I had, and I had one cousin who did that, so I just followed her path and I ended up in business school. So when I got there, I also tried to find some meaning in what I do, some purpose, and that's what led me to becoming a CSR consultant, corporate social responsibility. And then there's the story of Get Up.
Great, very interesting. And I think that your parents also shaped your story, and the way that they showed solidarity for other immigrants was something that was very important also in building your personality and your interest for social issues. So in which way do you think that being an immigrant's daughter has impacted your story?
Well, I think the first thing is that I know the other side of the story, and not the mainstream narrative about why do people come to Europe just for the money, and then they just send it back home. And so my parents, the very reason they came here was really not for the money. It was more for the values and what they thought they would find here, which they didn't, by the way, at least not the way they thought they would. And so yeah, knowing that and knowing what it cost them to do that, they left their whole family back in Morocco. They started over here because all their diplomas, my mom, for example, she was highly educated in Morocco when she came here. And when she came here, all her diplomas were worth nothing. So she had to start over at A level. And they stayed here. They really started over. They built a whole life for themselves. So that first cliche about immigrants, I know it's completely wrong. So from there, I started learning to forge ideas of my own opinions about topics, and not just take the mainstream narrative for granted and for face value. And that's the first thing. And also, I guess my parents also raised me to be a balanced but proud Muslim, which is very hard in this society, in which pushes you really to question everything, because you know more than anyone what people project on Muslim people and Muslim women, and Muslim women wearing the headscarf and all. And so you have to question that. You have to question, is my religion really that? What's wrong with, am I really a bad person? What's going on? And then you question the rest of society. And so I think that really built in me a very independent mind. I'm not influenced. I really want to go to the bottom of things before making my mind about the topic. And I think that's the main, this and wanting to serve society and be useful for society, these are the two main heritage my parents gave me.
And how much do you think identity has been an issue in your childhood or in your youth, and then a wealth later? Because that's something that we experience a lot. I can say the same as an immigrant's daughter in Italy or in France or in other European countries. We often have to struggle between our different identities that overlap. Being a woman additionally can be also an added burden, or something that you can turn into a power, by the way. So what do you think?
I think you're right. I think it's extremely interesting how, and maybe we're going to talk about it like when we talk about the keys as well, but turning stigma into strength is a very effective way to move forward. But for that, you really have to learn about you, about your story, about first your parents' story, your community's story, your background, everything. Own it, really, for it to become a strength. And in my case, I think just like you, I mean, we're both women. We're both like of immigration descent. And we also have we're also Muslim, which is also another identity. And we also have a fourth one. Maybe we'll have more, but fourth one for me, which was really important, was that I was coming from the suburbs, from the banlieue, which is also an identity in my country. So there's all sorts of ideas that we project on youth from the banlieue, from, ability to speak proper French, to the music we listen to, the food, how they imagine our families to be. There's a whole identity that society built for the youth of the suburbs, which I had to carry on my back for a long time before realizing that half of it is wrong and the rest of it is not a problem. It's actually a strength. So, for example, I was a bit when I arrived in business school, for example, I didn't really want to talk about all the problems that I faced when I was younger, the poverty, the violence and stuff like that, because I thought that it was, it was not a shame, but it was problematic, and it was just not add any value to the table. But then I realized, growing up in this environment and understanding what the system produces as inequalities, that no one else sees. I mean, if you grow up in the fifth district of Paris, you will never see this. You will never understand. You'll maybe read somewhere that some people, for them €5 is as decisive as if they're going to eat for the rest of the month or not. But you're not really going to understand that. But when you have a neighbor who knocks on your door at the end of the month to ask you for rice, for eggs, for, basic stuff, because they couldn't buy them for that last week and they would pay you back, then you understand really what it means. And so growing up in that environment really helped me understand the world better and the consequences of all the policies that are really abstract and all. And then I realized that it was really a strength.
Do you think that you were ashamed at the beginning of your situation? Because I kind of found myself in the same situation when I arrived in a grande école, in a French elite school, and that's precisely what we witnessed, is that there are, as you say, at least two friends. And when you, as an immigrant daughter coming from an underprivileged neighborhood or background, you arrive to this school, how do you feel, and how your place is questioned by the others, or how do you feel as a woman arriving there?
I mean, when I went into business school, which is an elite school, and it was really the first time I started living in a very different environment from mine, different social background. I didn't understand the norms, the codes, the social rules that they had. So my first, attitude was to take a step back and just like pull myself out of the group and just like look at them. And I didn't want to talk about really like all these topics because I didn't know how they would react, and I didn't know how I would react to their reaction. Because I remember also like the first year I arrived in business school, there was like, we were not that many people from the banlieue, right? Like not many people of black with black skin or brown people, right? So in my class, we were 2 first year. And at some point, one dude just like tried to be funny and talked to another Arab guy in my class. And he referred to him as Mohamed Merah. I don't know if you remember who that guy is. It was a terrorist that, carried some attacks in Toulouse some years ago. And so if he found it funny to just compare him to Mohamed Merah because it was the first Arab guy he met, and his first thought of an Arab guy was that terrorist guy. And it was like so, like chill, and like no one ever said anything. And him and I, we looked at each other like, what is going on? Like, is this like how we're going to live like our studies here? Is it going to be like that every day? And so the first times you just like, you want to hold back, you don't want to show too much because you don't know what it's going to lead to. But then with everything we talked about and, the introspection, and I recommend everyone to read François Fanon if they can. It's a really like good example of that work that we all have to do to deconstruct the stereotypes and the sense, like the feeling of being inferior that sometimes we just accept and integrate in our way of thinking. And what he wrote in the work he did, François Fanon, is really about deconstructing all of that. And so I read a lot during that time, and it's one of the readings I did, and it took me some time to really deconstruct all of that and become very confident with all these identities and talk about it a lot and try and talk about it as much as I can to normalize it, to give an opportunity to people to ask questions and talk about it, and for that to become normal, right? So sometimes I tend to over-talk about it, but when I, in the first place, didn't really talk about it. But I think it's important to just own it, and that's what I think I did.
Definitely. And the moment that you realize that you own your story, then you're more able to express it, but also to find your place within society. And do you think this is the moment where you thought about Get Up? How this idea came and translated into action?
I think Get Up was the outcome of a lot of things, because it happened at the end of my studies. So I was finishing business school. I was doing an internship in the US, in New York, and I was staying in Harlem with a friend, and I felt at home because it was like really like my suburb in Paris, which was the first shock for me. I was like, how is it possible that on the other side of the planet I feel at home? I felt the same as these people who grew up in Harlem or the Bronx. I have the same relationship with police, with school. I don't really feel like I belong all the time. So when we spoke, I really felt like we connected on so many different levels, which was the first trigger for me. And then I realized how the grassroots organizations there work with their youth from underprivileged areas. And they really put them in the center of the actions. They teach them to become the change they want to see in society, and they give them the tools, which we didn't really do back in France. In France, we have a very different, like we had at least when I grew up in the 90s, a very different way of dealing with these topics. We would help the children of the banlieue do their homework, and maybe we would take them to a museum sometime, but there's nothing that tells them that they're part of society, that they belong, and that they can take action and also be part of what they want to see happening. And so when I came back home, I just felt like empowered. I also felt very French because it was the first time I had conversations with people who come from the same background as me, have the same experiences as me, and still disagree on different topics, on how we see the world, how we see society. And that's where I realized I was very French, which was the first time. Like, more than them addressing me as French, which is already something that doesn't really happen often to a brown woman in France. They would always ask you where you're from and blah, blah, blah. I never had these questions back in the US. So that was the first thing. And then realizing on my own that my ideas are very French, that my ideals are also very French. And then, so when I came home, I was like, okay, I need to find a way to share this experience with the youth in my community that will probably not have the opportunity to go to the US or somewhere that far, or maybe too late. And I wanted to share that. So the first thing we did was that we put them in front of computers, and we logged them with youth from the US and around the world, and we asked them to just talk about who they are and what it is to be French and what they want to do later and what they think about politics and it was like really a space where they could first value themselves, regain their own narrative. Like, we are French Senegalese, French-Moroccan. So this is what it's like to be French, but we also do that. Like, we also we go every summer to Morocco because our parents come from Morocco, stuff like that. And it was really empowering for them to be able to refer to themselves as French with their own words and talk about their lives and their stories with their own words and not what the media says and everything. So that was the first thing. That's how we created the first program, which combines these debate sessions and empowerment sessions with really like hard skills and soft skills training for them to be able to combine their self-confidence that they're gaining with their will to change the world and skills, networks, and platforms to be able to do so. So that's how we created Get Up.
Great. And do you think that identity, as you said, comes when we meet the other? Because often we don't really realize who we are until we just have to frame ourselves. And this is something that maybe helped these young people. And by the way, where is the European identity standing in all this? Do you think that you also realize that somehow this way of living is part of a broader project beyond the French system?
I think you're right. I think one of the main assets of diversity and why it's important to have diversity is that it teaches you so much. It teaches you about yourself, about your culture, it challenges you about the way you think of a problem. For example, when you have a designer, an engineer, like a researcher, all sitting at the table and trying to figure out the solution for a problem, they have 3 times more chance to finding a creative solution and an effective one than just like 3 engineers or 3 designers that would not see the problem in a 360 way. And definitely. And I think all the debates and the fuss around like immigration and stuff like that, I mean, it's bad for immigrants and sons of immigrants, but it's really useful for Europeans to try and redefine what's Europe, right? Because for example, in France, I grew up and I have never seen the TV or people in the media ask themselves what it is to be French until Muslims became very visible in French society. And then they started questioning themselves. No, they're not French, but what it is to be French. And then they started thinking about the values. And then, it's just called everything into question. And I think that's very important. That's one of the biggest roles of diversity, is to refresh the ideals, is to re-question everything and to help people learn more about who they are and their values, their culture and everything. So I think you're very right about that.
And I think also that, yes, in the European projects in itself is this guarantee of diversity. And how do you integrate the European Erasmus projects, all the tools that the European Union gives to NGOs. How do you use them in your association?
So we use Europe a lot because we were talking about it, but in Europe there is a lot of diversity. The Netherlands has nothing to do with France, which has nothing to do with the UK, which is leaving, by the way, which has nothing to do with Germany. We all have we have a common solid history, but we also have very different specificities and cultures, which, as we were saying, really helps question, are we doing this right? Are we thinking the right way? Is there something we're missing? So the way we use Europe in that way, we connect the youth from France and Germany or the UK, it's for them to compare their lifestyle, what their school system offers, what their healthcare system offers, and start realizing that maybe in France we have things that don't exist in the UK, but they also have stuff that are great and that we don't have and that maybe we could implement. So that's the first thing. And it develops also a sense of critical thinking that is really important. But we also use it, the way we said it earlier, for them, all of them, because we work with youth from underprivileged backgrounds everywhere in Europe. It also helps them to feel legitimate in their own country, feel that they belong, because they take the ambassador's role. So they talk about politics in their country, about culture in their country, which is not like a role they're given often. And it helps them really gain self-confidence and feel like it's their country as well. And then there's the next level, because they see that they have similarities in the way they lived, their struggles and all. They also realize that they're all European. Their common shared everyday life and struggles. And so they have to fight united against that. But also in terms of their responsibility for the rest of the world, because they also have, for most of them, immigrant backgrounds. And so they learn all together that Europe also has a responsibility when it comes to the migration crisis, when it comes to sustainable development and stuff like that. So also on an even more global level. And Europe is a really good scale to do that, because you can work on different countries, you can work on the level of Europe, and it really teaches you to become a citizen of the world eventually.
And you spoke about belonging, this sense of belonging, and how debating between Europeans and new generations Europeans helps understanding what we have in common. But you also spoke about a particularism that there is in France and some struggles that are particularly unique in our society, in this French society. So I'm wondering, what are the main obstacles that are common for immigrant sons in Europe? And also how to come back to this stigma, how to turn this stigma into action, how to use these obstacles as a power.
Things that come up a lot during the conversations we have with the youth around the world, and Europe especially, is issues around racism, around the relationship with the police, stops and frisks, the difficulty they see for their older brothers and sisters to have access to jobs, decent jobs, the harassment they feel from the media, always talking about them the wrong way and talking about, their background the wrong way. And then you have general concerns, like sometimes there are issues that affect everyone globally, like global warming. So that's what we talk about. And I think the main way to turn all these problems and this constant inequalities that we see on an everyday life is to understand them and understand that it's not because of who you are that you live that. For example, one of the main the thing that really struck me the most is that we took the youth from the suburbs of Paris to London to the Museum of Immigration, and they had the opportunity to talk with the Londonian youth about migrations, and they saw that even though they don't look the same, immigration here in France is mostly North African people and less Asian people, whereas in London and in the UK it's mostly Indian, Pakistani, and from people from Bangladesh a lot. And even though they don't look the same, they face the same struggles as children of immigrants. So they realized at that moment that it was not because they were Arab or Black or Indian. It was because they were in minority in the country, in the European country. And it was because of the history. All the countries where their parents were from were colonized countries. And so understanding that it's a systemic problem and not like a problem as an individual also deconstructs a lot the inferiority you can feel. So it's not because you're Black, it's because your parents came from a colonized country and you live in a European country. That's what's going on.
And do you think that this systemic discrimination has an impact in the way they see themselves and in the way they will ambition after to aim at a job position?
Definitely, and that's why we try, and our main goal is to deconstruct all of that, to help them understand that they are not less worth of anyone, that they have all the skills and all the intelligence they need to aim high, but it's just social barriers, it's prejudice that they can face. So we teach them, so they're aware that it's going to be harder, but you can do it. So helping them do that work really opens their mind. For example, we had like a lot of youth in the program who, after traveling to London and meeting the youth there, came back and said, I want to be able to do that more. I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to live in a foreign country. I want to be able to work in a foreign country. So they would start thinking about going on an exchange program. But to do that, you have to enroll in university. So they would, it would work like that. And then they would meet other people we meet throughout the program, the journalists that come and help us learn about critical thinking and fake news and all. They meet with journalists and they want to become journalists. They meet with activists and they want to become lawyers. So that's what we try and do, expose them and teach them about self, love and acceptance. And I think that's the key.
Yes, overcoming this imposter syndrome that prevents them from feeling that they belong, that they can be part of a society and aim at leadership position or even just at higher positions. And by the way, also the fact that you introduce them to journalists, to professionals, helps a lot, because often we as immigrants' sons and daughters especially, we lack of role models. We see that our parents often, they renounce to so much in order to give us a future, and therefore they don't maybe have the means or the time to spend with the children, and because of that children can't really get an advice from their parents to then make the right decisions. So how to fill this gap and how to fill this void of having a role model, having a person that advises you?
I think there's not a lot of options. Just show more people, broadcast more people, put people on television, in politics, in research, all the fields, and it's our job, our generation, to try and go as high as possible and talk about it. But it's also our allies' job to try and make room for us and make sure that they do everything they can to also help us overcome the barriers that exist as women, as people of color, I think it's a teamwork.
Definitely, and this representation, precisely, it's a real struggle that we face in Europe, not only at the national level, but especially at the European level. We don't have enough diversity, and maybe if we just had people at the political level that had the same backgrounds as us. Maybe this could help just to see that it is possible, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question for you regarding a key that you would like to share. So what is, just to conclude, your key for our audience?
We talked about so many keys. I think the biggest one is just to own who you are and accept who you are. And for doing that, you have to go to the bottom of things, learn about your story, try and understand your struggles, because it's not just you, it's a global problem. And I think that knowledge and the tools you will gain by learning will empower you to be able to take concrete actions and to have a real impact in the world.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Yasmin.
To conclude, my key for this episode is the programs that the Get Up NGO offers. In partnership with several members of the European Parliament, they select every year young people coming from the banlieue to do an internship at the European Parliament. So follow them and get in touch for more information. This was the end of our first episode. This podcast series is produced by Les Cavalcades. I also encourage you to follow us on social media, share with us your story of belonging, because every voice matters. And you can find us on all podcast platforms and even on YouTube. Stay tuned to hear more stories of the new Daughters of Europe.